I want to thank you all for coming. I was telling Wesley over here that I probably would not be here at 9 o'clock if I was not on stage. So I appreciate all of you. So I am currently developer of I'm going to stop that, and I'm going to reverse it. I'm currently Director of Developer Relations at Pluralsight, and I am also the co-owner at a tabletop game store called Opal Grove Games. That's relevant, and I am going to tell you how. As part of my sort of journey into game store ownership, my partner and I have done a lot of thinking and talking about what it means to be a really great game master. So for anybody who is not into role-playing games, that is essentially the person who leads you through the story, the person who sort of moderates a game as you're playing through this collective storytelling game together. And as I started thinking about this talk, I started thinking about a lot of parallels that I saw between leading a group of people, a group of friends through a game, through a story, and leading a team through chaos. So in order to do that, I want to kind of frame this conversation up. Maybe. There we go. The first thing that I think is super important. Oh, sorry. Look at that. There we go. Team member safety. It is absolutely the most important thing, your top priority as a DM or as a manager. For me and my team, that's where I start from at all times. And we're going to talk about biceps core needs. That's kind of a way to break down what that actually means. It's sort of easy to say, oh, I create a safe space for my team, but what does that actually entail? What does that mean to your team members? I want to stress that this does also include your safety. You have to be at your best, as best you can, so that you can be there for your team. You can't fill a cup that's empty. You can't fill any other cups from a cup that is empty. And you have at least some of that power as a manager. I'm going to talk about encouraging feedback. I want you to make it easy. Incorporate it into your work. Incorporate it into your routine, into the fabric of your team. And when you're doing that, make sure that you're recognizing, one, that power that you have, because your institutional power absolutely plays into that relationship with feedback within your team. But also, it plays into your relationships with your team members. Who is going to feel comfortable coming to you? Who's going to feel comfortable telling you what's wrong? Who's going to feel comfortable pushing back when they don't agree with you? So there's a framework for kind of thinking about these needs, biceps core needs. And I'd highly recommend looking through these, reading more about them. You can go to Paloma Medina's website to read more about each of these. But I'm going to talk about them each in brief. So belonging is our first one. Remember I said biceps. This is a really helpful acronym. So belonging is your team's sense of community. Do they feel as if they are close with the group, that they belong in the group? Now, this doesn't have to mean that your team feels like everybody's friends. This isn't actually a role-playing game. You don't have to like each other, but you have to respect each other, and you have to make sure that no one is feeling excluded. Improvement, so it's our eye and biceps. Your team wants to feel progress. They want to feel like they're moving forward. It's demoralizing to get stuck in your work. I felt that. I felt directionless. I felt like I wasn't making the moves that I should be making. And that can be really difficult to work through. And so feeling a sense of improvement. Choice is also important. Your team wants to feel like they have some agency in the work that they're doing. You're allowing them to have some choice, have some flexibility, have some influence over the work that they're doing is huge, and it can make even work that they don't enjoy feel more meaningful. And it doesn't mean that you just let anybody work on whatever they want. It means that where there is opportunity for choice, you're making sure that you're presenting that to your team. Do they have ownership over a particular domain? Do they have the ability to make decisions that matter within their sphere of expertise? Do you trust them to tell you about their particular specialty? Do you seek advice from them when you need to work on something that's in their realm? Do you rely on them for anything? Choice. Equality or fairness. So here we're talking about a lot of different aspects of fairness. We'll talk a little bit about bias and how that plays into things, but this is access to resources. So things like, are people paid fairly? Do you approach them with equal time? Do you pay attention to people equally? No one wants to feel like they're feeling left out. We're going to go back to belonging. But it's also reciprocity. Do they feel like they're able to contribute back to the team? Is everyone treated as if they're equally important? Predictability. Predictability is having some amount of certainty. And this gets into what we're going to talk about today. Are there challenges that they can see on the horizon? Do they see things coming? But also, do they feel safe? Do they know that you have enough runway to keep going? And the last one is significance. Your work has to feel like it has a clear sense of purpose. You want to be able to see how your work fits into the grand scheme of things. If your company has that North Star metric, how are you contributing to it? It feels, and a lot of people will gripe about that, but having something like that, having something that they know that they're contributing to is huge. It makes you feel as if you're part of something. So, a little bit of story time. We're going to take a break for a second. When I first started working through my thoughts about this talk, I was on a cursed team. I will say that again, I was on a cursed team. I don't believe in curses. Unless you're talking about bestow curse from D&D, I was not a believer. Until I was part of this team, at every point in the year, 14 months that I was on this team, at least 60% of the team was injured at some point. At least half of the team was sick at some point. Literally 7 out of 10 had some form of surgery. We had restructuring. We had So many different structural issues within the company and our organization. And during that time, I was sort of thrust into this position as an acting director. And so I've got people that are grieving. I've got a director whom I'm replacing, and I'm not immediately sure if they're coming back. I have not been trained for this. I don't have any documentation. I am daily trying to figure out, okay, who do we need to pay? Who do I need to make sure that they're safe? Also, how do we continue to do the work that we were already on track to do? How do we take a step back? How do we make it so that this whole situation does not happen again? How do we make sure that we're sustainable so that we can move forward, truly move forward, and not just stay in this realm of chaos forever? And so that's the standpoint from which I'm thinking about this talk. Being able to work through some of those things, ideally not all of them at once, in order to move forward in a way that feels safe for everyone. So I'm going to introduce some flavors of chaos that I've been thinking about that I think are maybe a little bit more applicable to other people. Hopefully you don't have all of that combination of things, but I'm interested to know, what are some flavors of chaos that you're dealing with now? Anybody? Or that you've dealt with in the past, you don't need to share. Current issues. I see a hand.
Team members with very different comfort zones, different personalities, positions in terms of structure versus autonomy.
So team members with very different comfort zones and very different positions in the organization and different needs that come from that. Mm-hmm. And in the back?
Changing product plans based on what's happening in generative AI.
Yep, absolutely. Changing product plans based on everything that's happening with generative AI. Sounded like that struck a nerve, for sure.
Waterfall timelines.
Waterfall timelines.
Team size just more than doubled in about 3 weeks.
Ooh, team size more than doubled in about 3 weeks. Yep, this same team, 10 people hired at once, from 0. Working through ambiguity and unclear expectations, going back to that predictability. It's so important. Absolutely. All of these things contribute to this sense of chaos, this feeling that my next step might not be safe. So we're going to talk about some of those things. So a lack of direction, and what we'll do is we'll kind of have that flavor of chaos up here, and then we'll talk through kind of some of the things that you can do. And then we'll talk more generally about how we can start to move forward together. So a lack of direction or uncertainty in your goals. So I think of this in the same way that I think about planning adventures for my team. We pick a direction. If we don't have one, we pick one. And we say, we think this is what's important. And actually, from some of the DevRel teams that I've been on, that's kind of the situation. Not everybody knows what to do with you. And you have to be the one to say, this is important. These are our metrics. This is how we help. And then you plan backwards. You link each of the steps, each of those goals to each other until you get to something that works for you and your team. And it can include multiple paths. It can mean that you build in some of that flexibility for yourself. But when you're in that situation, I think it's important to let your skills, your capability be the guide. take what you know, take what you can do, take what you want to work on, and map that to the goals that you do know of, even if you're not being given that directive. Now, burnout's another huge one. That could be a whole talk. We're not going to go too deep on it. But again, I recommend starting slow. When you are coming back, specifically when you're coming back from burnout, or you're trying to come back from burnout, and we're trying to guide someone who is coming back, it's, at least in my experience, people have a tendency to want to just jump right back in and be able to feel like they are perceived as being competent and ready to hit the ground running. And that's not always possible. It's not always healthy. You don't want to kick somebody back into their burnout phase. I think it's important to address it as well. A lot of people feel like they have to just move past quickly, but checking in, talking through how they're affected by what they've just been through, and mixing up the work so that it doesn't happen again. Conflict, and in this case, I'm specifically talking about conflict between team members. Yet again, this same team I'm talking about, we had a team member who just deeply violated another team member's sense of privacy. And dealing with that was incredibly frustrating for me in terms of my relationship with the organization, but within the team, within your sphere of control. One, I think it's important to set expectations for how you treat each other early. In my case, I do that through a team charter. And in that team charter, you talk about, one, your team's goals, your team's mission, but also your expectations for how you treat each other. When are we working? What are our core hours if you have that concept? And also, what do we expect from each other? How do we support each other? When something like this happens, when it's clear, you shut it down. You shut it down early. And you have to recognize that some people may leave. If you're not able to work through the issue, if you don't actually have the power to support your team in that way, people may leave. And that's just a consequence of, that's a possible consequence of this kind of conflict. And I think I would be remiss if we didn't talk about the large-scale trauma that a lot of us have been through, some of us kind of compacting several of them. It's important here to think about how whatever specific trauma you're talking about is going to affect some people more strongly than others. And you're not always going to know who those people are. And so consider whatever you can do to alter the workload in those cases. This is a much smaller example. But again, on that same team, I had someone who was just deathly afraid of flying on airplanes. This was a developer relations team, and we did events. And eventually we got to the point where this person felt comfortable enough to tell me, I have a phobia, and I have to drug myself in order to get to this event. And I need someone to be there with me to the very last moment. I couldn't get a friend to actually fly with me this time. And this was pretty close to the event, but eventually I was like, don't go. We'll survive. When I say altering the workload, sometimes that means, you know what, you don't have to do this. You don't have to do this if it's going to harm you. And if that's something, if the trauma is something that they're able and willing to work through right now, then great. They can go do that with their therapist, which is not you, though sometimes it will feel that way. But wherever you can, stepping back and looking at your expectations and figuring out where they can bend. Again, you are not the therapist, probably. Maybe some of you are, but not in this instance, not in this relationship. And you want to be recognizing that everybody is going to grieve in their own way. Everybody is going to react to these different things differently. And so, again, if you're familiar with RPGs, there's this concept of a session zero. And that is when you are coming together as a group for the first time. Usually you are doing some amount of world building, some amount of character creation, and also some amount of setting expectations for the way the campaign or the game is going to go. And I recommend doing the same thing on your teams. You don't have to call it session zero, but a meeting ideally periodically. Maybe that's quarterly for you, maybe it's biannual, but checking in to reset those expectations, reset those boundaries, and discuss your goals as a team and individually. You want to also take a moment to take stock of everybody's strengths. What have people been learning? What have they improved on? Where do they want support now? This is also another moment where you can reinforce the need for feedback. Between team members, I have a whole other workshop on peer-to-peer feedback because I think it's so important and something that we don't spend enough time on, especially when we're talking about things like code review. But repeatedly, at every opportunity, encourage your team to provide that feedback constructively and respectfully, but providing that feedback. One way that I really love to set some of those expectations is to use, I call them personal user manuals. I've heard a couple different versions of that, but these are some of the questions that I ask or that I prompt my team members to answer when we're writing those user manuals. So the sort of big bullet points are your values, your communication style, your work preferences, and then your areas for growth. What's important to you? Why do you want to do this? How should I communicate with you? What's going to land? And when everybody has those things written down and you can reference them, you don't have to have the awkward conversation about, like, why didn't you answer my Slack message? Oh, it's because I find Slack overwhelming and I prefer email. That's not me at all. It's fine. Nothing to see here. Also, preferences. What brings you here? What do you enjoy about this? Some final tips for the beginner GM. You can call that, maybe it's game master, maybe it's game manager. When I say balanced preparation and improvisation, I mean be flexible, but also know where you're trying to go. And that means, in part, learning your own style, figuring out how you work best so that you can model a lot of these behaviors for your team. Trusting your reports and trusting yourself. You don't have to know everything, and that's part of why you have a team. And for a lot of you, these people are going to be experts in something, and you can rely on them. In the game context, I don't need to know every single rule, but I can trust that each of my players understands the rules as they pertain to their character. Or I should be able to. And remember that you, like I said, you have great power. You control, in a lot of ways, the flow of information, but it's not an adversarial relationship. Where you're able to insert more of that information, over-communicate. I want to say thank you to all of you for being with me first thing in the morning. My name is Aisha Blake, and I'd love it if you reached out to me on Twitter, on Twitch wherever you like.